Welcome to Lesson 1 of Module 1 of an Intuitive Introduction to Probability. So, we want to talk about probabilities. Before we get into formulas and calculations, it's really worthwhile to think about what is a probability and how do we define probability. Interestingly, there's not just one definition of probability. There are three widely accepted definitions of probability. And so, before we look at some slides and examples, let's talk about the three definitions. The first definition, called the classical probability, or also the definition of exact probability, is objective probability, is the one that we use when we play games with cards or with dice, or if you go to the casino. Here we see I have four options. If I choose a card, we see there are three black cards and then there's the ace of hearts. And now if I ask you what's the question if I shuffle those cards and pull a card, what's the probability this is the ace of hearts? I think you and I can agree on it. It's 1 in 4, 25% probability. Objective, I think there's very little discussion, unless you think I'm cheating. There's very little discussion and we can quickly agree on the probability. This particular definition is very limited. It's very simple, intuitive. Maybe that's what you saw in high school, in college, or in other classes. And we like it because it's so easy. But frankly, in everyday decision making, it's utterly useless. The reason is it's very limited. It requires that all outcomes, like in these cards, all four cards are equally likely and we can easily agree on the probabilities. Often that's not the case. And therefore we need two more definitions of probability, which both actually turn out to be way more useful in everyday decision making. So let's talk about the second definition. It's called the empirical definition of probability, also the definition according to relative frequencies. What's that? In those situations, we look at past data. For example, before a pharmaceutical company can bring a new drug to market, it has to do a lot of tests. The idea behind these tests is now to assess the probability that this new drug will help a patient with a particular condition. We also want to assess the probability that there will be side effects. So what does a pharmaceutical company do? It gives the drug in some test to patients, and then it checks out, do the patients feel better? Do we have side effects? And based on this data, it then determines probabilities, empirical frequencies that it has seen in the past in the trials to assess the probability of side effects. Similarly, when we look at stock market data, past data, to say something about the future performance of a particular investment, then we also essentially talk about the relative frequency definition. We look at past data, and from those past data points we derive assessments for the probabilities. That's the second definition. Again, the empirical probability definition or relative frequency definition. But even that definition is not always helpful. What do you do when there is no past data, when you're in an utterly new situation? For example, when Apple came out with the iPad, they didn't have past data on iPad sales. This was a brand new product that hadn't existed before. So the company couldn't look at past data. And it wasn't just a 1 in 4 chance, because it was unclear what could happen in the market. At this point, they needed the third definition, the subjective probability definition. The company had to assess the likelihood of success, the likelihood of failure, and based on that make the decision whether to bring the product to market or not. And that's the third definition that occasionally we have to use. Based on perhaps my gut feeling or my life experience, I assess uncertain situation without data and without the easy counting that I can do with cards. To summarize the key takeaways of this first lesson, there are three very different definitions of probability. One, the first one, the easiest one, the exact definition that we use when we play cards. Second, if we have lots of data available and we think this past data is relevant for a probabilistic assessment, we use the relative frequency definition. And finally, the third definition, if I don't even have data, the subjective probability definition. In the next lesson, we will define these three concepts more precisely using some mathematical language. Thank you, and please come back to the next class.